take that chance.
For the fans of the hardcore fantasy genre, The Witcher is probably the biggest thing to have arrived from Netflix. Even though The Witcher fans hate it, the series draws many comparisons with the HBO series Game of Thrones, except of course for the fizzled out ending that left many Throners dissatisfied, mostly because we have yet to see how The Witcher will pan out in the next seasons. But for now, let's take a look at some of the strictest rules that The Witcher cast had to follow to do their part in creating such an intricate world, or continent, if you will. But first, a simple reminder on how to enter our brand new giveaway. We're giving away either an iPhone X Max, the new iPad mini, or a MacBook Pro. It's all your choice. So be sure to leave a like, comment the keyword, subscribe, and turn on notifications to enter this giveaway. It's really that simple. Rule number 1, no Game of Thrones actors. Ian Beattie, who played Meryn Trant, allegedly auditioned for a role in The Witcher, but he was banned from doing so due to the strict no Game of Thrones rule in the casting sheet. You can clearly see why. The two shows already have a lot of similarities that casting a Game of Thrones actor would just make it impossible to tell the two shows apart. Despite this strict rule, a couple of Game of Thrones actors actually found their way into the cast of The Witcher. That includes Francis McGee, or Yerga, who played Yorn in the Game of Thrones. The same goes for Jodie May, or Queen Calanthe, who is Maggie in Game of Thrones. Maybe they didn't audition and were handpicked because of how perfect they were for their roles in The Witcher. After all, you can always be the exception to any rule if you're good enough. Number 2, the actor playing Geralt had to undergo extensive sword training. We all know that out of 200-something auditionees, it was Henry Cavill who ended up with the role of Geralt. His physique and voice were almost ready for the coveted role, but he still had to perfect his fighting skills. So as a rule, he had to undergo an intense sword training course, and Cavill really went for it. In an interview, he said he spent all of his free time with a sword in hand, even when he wasn't on set. He said he wanted to get used to the weight of the sword so he could easily swing it around for intense fight scenes. So he had 3 swords at home and 4 at work, and it was just non-stop practice, practice, practice. Talk about dedication to the role. Next rule. This was more apparent for Henry Cavill, but notice how most of the fight scenes in The Witcher actually looked like well-choreographed dances? That's the doing of Vladimir Furdik, veteran stuntman and fight designer who also worked on Game of Thrones and even ended up getting cast as the Night King. He wanted to give Geralt a dance-like fighting style, so everyone who was ever in a fight scene with him had to learn an entire choreography that felt more like dance than fighting. But it all played out pretty well in the final cut, not to mention, everyone did nicely in the actual cotillion dance scene. Next rule, Anya Chalotra did most of the intimate scenes herself. This is more of a rule that Anya set for herself because she respected the character of Yennefer too much to rely on a body double for some of the most important scenes. Producers actually had a body double ready to jump in for the sensual scenes, but when Anya watched the scenes with the double, she decided it would be best to roll up her sleeves and jump in front of the camera herself. In an interview with Metro Online, Anya said she realized very quickly that she didn't feel comfortable with anyone else portraying Yennefer. So yep, those intimate scenes between Yennefer and Istrid were portrayed by the actual actors. Next rule, Henry Cavill comes up with most of his dialogue. As a strict rule, Henry was given the liberty to come up with his own dialogue, or the lack of it. Apparently, Henry's performance was so on point that he didn't even need much of the dialogue that was written for the character of Geralt. According to writer and showrunner Lauren Schmidt, Henry brought a lot of quality subtleties to his character and found emotional resonance in small moments, so people can actually understand the character better without the huge chunks of dialogue that just ended up drawing attention away from how Henry was acting out the character rather than speaking him into existence. By the time they got to the finale of the first season, they didn't even shoot half the dialogue because they just knew there was so much Henry could do with Geralt that just didn't require Lauren's words. Next rule, no one is allowed to tell Henry whom the Witcher is killing in advance. Here's another strategy that allowed Henry Cavill to completely portray Geralt in his own terms. He was only given 3 seconds of preparation for scenes where Geralt had to kill another character. According to stuntmaster Vladimir Furdik, he wanted everything to appear raw but effortless. So Henry Cavill walks into a scene and gets exactly 3 seconds to plan how Geralt will kill the character in front of him. Naturally, the rest of the cast cannot tell him if any of their characters were due to die that day, or else he'd have way more time to prepare for the scene. As challenging as this may sound, Henry completely floored Furdik. Speaking at the Karlovy Vary International Film Festival, Furdik said said, "Henry is excellent, and without him, Netflix wouldn't be able to do The Witcher. I can guarantee that. I don't know any actors who are that good with a sword and fight scenes overall as Henry is. I have never met anyone who could learn fight choreography for a scene in 2 hours." Next rule, if Henry does his own dialogue, Joe Batty does his own singing. Of course, Henry is not the only ultra-talented member of The Witcher's cast. As a rule, Joey doesn't get any doubles for Jasker's singing parts. Yep, not even voice actor doubles. Apparently, Joey is not only one heck of a singer, but he actually plays the lute too. He learned this handy trick for his role as Mark Smeaton in Wolf Hall. Next rule, members of the cast had to figure out an accent that works for their character. Henry, for instance, had to ditch his natural accent in favor of a more neutral, almost American one. Steve Wall, who plays Bohalt, felt like the East London-inspired accent for the Reavers in the video game didn't really fit with the setting, so he based his character's accent off the series' Slovakian fight choreographer. Yep, Vladimir Furdik himself. I guess it's safe to say neither Game of Thrones nor The Witcher would be as amazing as they turned out to be without Furdik. Next rule, Henry Cavill had to maintain his incredibly deep, gruff voice for the role. Lauren Schmidt, the writer, admitted that while writing the script, she kept hearing Cavill's voice in her head speaking Geralt's lines, but instead of his normal voice, Cavill adapted a deeper, manlier voice for this role. Doug Cockle, the American voice artist who provided Geralt's voice in the video games, was impressed. Doug said many fans contacted him after the release of the trailer of The Witcher to ask him if Cavill's deep voice had been influenced by Cockle, given the fact that Cavill is a huge fan of the video games and has played them multiple times, so he would be extremely familiar with Doug's voice. Here's how committed Henry is to the rule about keeping his deep voice. Set reports revealed that Cavill maintained his deep voice on set even when filming for the day had already ended. Next rule, all The Witcher cast members had to know their characters to heart. The Witcher draws a lot of inspiration from Polish and Celtic traditions, and the showrunners were keen on respecting the lore and tradition that the show is based on. All the actors had to be respectful of the lore at all times by knowing all the creatures and factions at heart, because all of those had real cultural backdrops. Next rule, Henry Cavill had to sustain his CGI-level physique. The Telegraph published an interview with Henry Cavill during the show's pre-production, which revealed that the role of Geralt would require him to pump his body up to CGI levels of muscularity. But Cavill didn't think this was much of a challenge because he enjoyed it. The former Man of Steel out-muscled himself, which is saying a lot for someone who already played Superman, but Henry admitted he had his genes to thank for this. He said he's lucky enough to have the genetics that result in quick changes, which allow him to get really quite big if he sets his mind to it. But it didn't come too easy for him. For Cavill to remain incredibly shredded, he had a special diet and training program that he observed for the entire time he was preparing for Season 1. His trainer created the program for Henry, so he preferred to call it Henry's Diet instead of The Witcher's Diet. But in any case, it helped Cavill prepare for one of his most iconic scenes to date, the bathtub scene. Fans of the video game would remember this image well because it was also one of the game highlights. But this brings us to our last and most important rule that all cast members of The Witcher had to follow, and that rule is to take inspiration from the books, not the video games. This might surprise you, but the Netflix adaptation of The Witcher is actually an adaptation of the original books and not the video games. What many people forget is that the bathtub scene was not only iconic in reference to the video games, it was actually exported from the books because, as mentioned earlier, the Netflix series used the books as their basis. So yep, the actors may have been given enough freedom to play around with their characters, but they were also specifically ordered to make more reference from the books than the video games when building the character. And that wraps up all the strict rules the Witcher cast had to follow for Season 1, at least.